In the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where golden spires pierce morning clouds and traditions run deeper than the mountain roots themselves, a single decision threatens to shatter 1,000 years of royal legacy. Princess Alara Whitmore stands at the threshold of her coronation, her sapphire eyes reflecting not joy, but defiance. The crown that should unite a nation has become the symbol of her greatest rebellion. For 3 centuries, the Blackthorn family has served as the royal consorts, their bloodline intertwined with the throne through marriage, politics, and secrets darker than the castle's ancient dungeons. But now, as Alara prepares to become queen, she has issued an ultimatum that echoes through every corridor of Ravencrest Palace. She will refuse the crown unless every member of the Blackthorn family is stripped of their titles, their lands, and their influence over the kingdom forever. The kingdom holds its breath. Nobles whisper behind silk fans. Common folk gather in taverns, wondering if their future queen has lost her mind or found her courage. And, in the shadows of the palace, the Blackthorn family plots their response to a challenge that could destroy them all. This is not just a story of royal politics. This is the tale of a woman who discovered that the price of a crown might be her very soul, and the dangerous game that begins when she decides that price is too high to pay. What drove a beloved princess to such a drastic ultimatum? What secrets lie buried in the Blackthorn legacy? And will Valdoria survive the storm that's about to break? The answers begin here, in a kingdom where love and betrayal dance together in the shadows of power, and where the greatest battles are fought not on fields of war, but in the hearts of those who would be kings and queens. The morning mist clung to the towers of Ravencrest Palace like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their hold on the ancient stones. Princess Alara Whitmore stood at her chamber window, watching the sun struggle to break through the gray veil that seemed to mirror the shadows gathering around her heart. In just 3 days, she would walk down the great hall's crimson carpet to receive the crown of Valdoria, a ceremony that should have filled her with pride and purpose. Instead, each passing hour brought only deeper dread. The soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding thoughts. "Come," she called, not turning from the window. Her voice carried the weight of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. Lady Margaret Fairfield, her oldest friend and most trusted advisor, entered with the careful steps of someone bearing unwelcome news. "Your Highness, the Council of Lords has requested an urgent audience. They're concerned about the rumors circulating through the palace." Alara finally turned, her emerald silk dressing gown flowing around her like water. At 25, she possessed the kind of beauty that had inspired countless portraits and even more marriage proposals from foreign princes. But today, her usually bright eyes held a steely determination that made Margaret step back involuntarily. "Let them be concerned," Alara said, moving to her writing desk where dozens of parchments lay scattered like fallen leaves. "I've made my position clear. The Blackthorn family will not play puppet master to another Valdorian monarch." Margaret closed the door behind her and approached cautiously. "Alara, you must reconsider. The Blackthorns have been part of this kingdom's foundation for centuries. Lord Victor Blackthorn serves as your father's chief advisor. His son Marcus commands the royal guard. Lady Catherine oversees the kingdom's charitable works. You cannot simply cast them aside like common criminals." "Can't I?" Alara's laugh held no warmth. "Tell me, Margaret, what do you know of the Ashford Rebellion?" The question struck Margaret like a physical blow. Her face paled, and she sank into the velvet chair beside Alara's desk. "That was 20 years ago, during your father's early reign. A group of northern lords tried to overthrow the crown. They were defeated, and their leaders executed for treason. That's the official story, yes." Alara picked up a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "But this tells a different tale. I found it hidden in my mother's belongings, sealed away in a secret compartment I discovered quite by accident while searching for her jewelry for the coronation." Margaret watched as Alara opened the journal, revealing pages covered in Queen Isabella's delicate handwriting. The sight of her deceased queen's script brought tears to Margaret's eyes, but Alara's expression remained hard as granite. "My mother documented everything, Margaret. Every conversation, every meeting, every decision that shaped this kingdom during the first years of her marriage to my father." Alara's finger traced the words as she read. The Ashford Rebellion wasn't a simple power grab by ambitious lords. It was a response to discovering that the Blackthorns had been manipulating royal policies for their own gain, bleeding the northern territories dry through unfair taxation and land seizures. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered. But her conviction wavered as she saw the pain in her friend's eyes. Lord Gareth Ashford wasn't a traitor, Margaret. He was a patriot who tried to save his people from systematic oppression orchestrated by Victor Blackthorn's father. When Ashford brought evidence to my father, it mysteriously disappeared. When he tried to present his case to the Royal Council, he was accused of fabricating documents and plotting against the crown. Alara turned the page, revealing a sketch of a man with kind eyes and graying hair. This is Lord Ashford, drawn by my mother just weeks before his execution. She met with him in secret, here in these very chambers. He showed her proof that the Blackthorns had been forging royal documents, stealing from the treasury, and selling military secrets to neighboring kingdoms. Margaret leaned forward, studying the journal with growing horror. If this is true, why didn't Queen Isabella expose them? Because, Alara's voice cracked slightly. 3 days after this entry, my mother fell mysteriously ill. The same illness that would eventually claim her life when I was 10 years old. The implications hung in the air like a poison cloud. Margaret's hand flew to her throat as the pieces of a horrific puzzle began falling into place. You think that the Blackthorns. I think my mother discovered something that made her a threat to their power, and they eliminated that threat. Alara closed the journal and held it against her chest like a shield. I think Lord Ashford died not as a traitor, but as the last man brave enough to stand against their corruption. And I think my father, blind with grief and manipulated by those he trusted most, allowed the real villains to write the history books. Margaret stood and began pacing, her mind racing through the implications. Even if this is all true, Alara, you cannot make such accusations without absolute proof. The Blackthorns have allies throughout the kingdom. If you move against them and fail, then I'll share the same fate as Lord Ashford and my mother. Alara moved to her window again, watching as carriages began arriving in the courtyard below. Noble families from across Valdoria had come for her coronation, unaware that they might instead witness the collapse of everything they held sacred. But if I do nothing, I become complicit in their crimes. I become the puppet they've been grooming since birth. The truth was more complex than even Margaret knew. Over the past months, Alara had been conducting her own investigation with the help of Sir Thomas Crowe, a young knight whose father had served Lord Ashford. What they had uncovered painted an even darker picture of Blackthorn treachery. The family's corruption ran like poison through every aspect of Valdorian society. They had been selling royal pardons to criminals, manipulating trade agreements to benefit their own merchant ventures, and slowly placing their allies in key positions throughout the government. Most damning of all, they had been corresponding with King Roderick of Drakmore, Valdoria's ancient enemy, providing him with detailed information about military defenses and political weaknesses. But perhaps the most personal betrayal had been discovered just 1 week ago, when Sir Thomas had returned from his mission to the Northern Territories. In the ruins of Lord Ashford's estate, he had found a hidden chamber containing documents that would have proven the Lord's innocence beyond doubt. Among them was a letter from Queen Isabella to Lord Ashford, promising to help him present his evidence to the king and expressing her own suspicions about the Blackthorns' loyalty. The letter was dated just 2 days before the Queen's final illness began. There's more, isn't there? Margaret asked, recognizing the look on her friend's face. Alara nodded slowly. Marcus Blackthorn has been using his position as captain of the Royal Guard to eliminate anyone who gets too close to the truth. Sir William Hartwell, who questioned discrepancies in the Treasury records, died in a riding accident last spring. Lady in Pemberton, who noticed irregularities in the charitable fund distributions, succumbed to a sudden fever just before she was to meet with my father. The pattern becomes clear once you know what to look for. Margaret sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. What do you plan to do? I plan to end it. Alara's voice carried the steel of absolute determination. At the coronation ceremony, before God and the kingdom, I will refuse the crown unless every member of the Blackthorn family renounces their titles and leaves Valdoria forever. I will present my evidence to the assembled nobles and let them judge for themselves whether the family that has served as royal advisors for 3 centuries has been serving the crown or themselves. And if they refuse to go quietly? Alara smiled, but it held no warmth. Then, I will make them understand that some prices are too high to pay, even for a crown. Outside her window, she could see Lord Victor Blackthorn arriving with his usual entourage of supporters and sycophants. The man who had been her father's closest advisor for 2 decades looked every inch the perfect courtier, with his silver hair perfectly arranged and his dark blue doublet embroidered with the royal crest. But now that Alara knew what to look for, she could see the calculation behind his friendly smile, the assessment in his pale blue eyes as he surveyed the gathering crowd. Marcus Blackthorne rode beside his father, his red hair catching the morning light as he supervised the positioning of the royal guard. At 30, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in the kingdom, and Alara knew her father had been hoping for a marriage between them that would cement the Blackthorne alliance forever. The irony was not lost on her that she was preparing to destroy the very family her father had wanted her to join. Lady Catherine Blackthorne, Victor's sister, emerged from her own carriage with characteristic grace. At 55, she remained beautiful and commanded enormous respect for her charitable works throughout the kingdom. But Alara now wondered how much of that charity had been funded by stolen gold, and whether the lady's kindness had always come with strings attached. As if sensing her scrutiny, Lord Victor looked up toward her window. For a moment, their eyes met across the courtyard, and Alara saw something flicker in his expression. Suspicion, perhaps, or calculation. He inclined his head in a respectful bow, but his smile seemed forced. "He knows," Alara murmured to herself. "What?" Margaret asked, moving to join her at the window. "Lord Victor knows that I suspect something. Look at how he's watching the palace, how he's positioning his people. He's preparing for a confrontation." Indeed, as they watched, several of Marcus's guards took up positions that seemed more strategic than ceremonial. The Blackthorne supporters among the arriving nobles were being subtly guided toward specific areas of the courtyard, and Alara noticed that escape routes were being blocked by what appeared to be casual conversation groups. "They're isolating potential allies," Margaret observed, her political instincts sharpened by years of court intrigue. "Lord Harrison and Earl Westbrook are both being surrounded by Blackthorne supporters. They won't be able to coordinate any response to your accusations." Alara nodded grimly. "They've had decades to perfect this game, Margaret. Every noble family has members who owe the Blackthorns favors, who have been enriched by their schemes, or who fear their retribution. When I make my stand, I may find myself very much alone." A new arrival caught their attention as a modest carriage bearing the crest of the Eastern Territories pulled into the courtyard. From it emerged a young man with sandy brown hair and determined eyes that Alara recognized immediately. "Sir Thomas has returned," she said with relief. "And he's not alone." Indeed, the carriage carried 3 additional passengers who emerged with the careful movements of people who had traveled far and hard. They were dressed simply but carried themselves with the dignity of nobility, and Alara's heart leaped as she recognized their significance. "The Ashford survivors," Margaret whispered. "You found them." Alara smiled for the first time in days. Sir Thomas found them living in exile in the Eastern Kingdoms, where they fled after their patriarch's execution. Lord Ashford's younger brother Samuel, his daughter Lady Rebecca, and his grandson James. They've been waiting 20 years for the chance to clear their family name and see justice done. The reunion in the courtyard was brief but meaningful as Sir Thomas quickly escorted the Ashford family toward a side entrance, avoiding the main crowds where Blackthorne supporters might recognize them. But the moment didn't go entirely unnoticed. Alara saw Marcus Blackthorne's head turn sharply toward the new arrivals, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt before he caught himself. "The endgame begins," Alara murmured, watching as the various players took their positions for the confrontation that would reshape Valdoria forever. Margaret grasped her friend's arm gently. "Are you certain about this path, Alara? Once you start this fight, there will be no turning back. The kingdom could tear itself apart." Alara covered Margaret's hand with her own, drawing strength from the friendship that had sustained her through so many trials. "The kingdom is already wounded, Margaret. It's been bleeding slowly for 20 years while the Blackthorns have fed on its life force like parasites. Sometimes the only way to save a patient is to cut out the infection, even if the surgery itself is dangerous. And if you're wrong, if the evidence isn't enough to convince the nobles, then I'll face whatever consequences come with honor, knowing I chose truth over convenience." Alara turned from the window and moved toward her wardrobe, where the ceremonial gown for her coronation hung like a golden ghost. "But I don't think I'm wrong, Margaret. The pieces fit too perfectly, and the pattern of death and disappearance that follows anyone who threatens the Blackthorns is too consistent to be coincidence." She paused before the gown, running her fingers over the intricate embroidery that had taken master craftsmen months to complete. It was beautiful enough to make angels weep, and wearing it would fulfill the dreams she had cherished since childhood. But Looking at it now, she saw only chains disguised as silk and gold. Besides, she added with a wry smile, I've learned something important about myself these past few weeks. I would rather be a princess without a crown who stands for justice than a queen with all the power in the world who rules through lies and blood. Margaret nodded slowly, recognizing the transformation that had taken place in her friend. The sheltered princess who had once worried mainly about gowns and garden parties had evolved into a woman of steel and purpose, tempered by truth and sharpened by righteous anger. What would you have me do? Margaret asked. Help me prepare for the most important performance of my life. Alara moved to her desk and began organizing the evidence she had compiled. In 3 days, I will walk into that great hall not as a bride coming to marry her kingdom, but as a prosecutor bringing justice to those who have escaped it for far too long. Outside, the bells of Ravencrest Palace began to chime the noon hour, their bronze voices carrying across the courtyard where nobles continued to arrive for what they expected to be a celebration of continuity and tradition. None of them could have imagined that they were instead gathering for a reckoning that had been 20 years in the making. In her chamber high above the gathering storm, Princess Alara Whitmore began the final preparations for a confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the kingdom she had been born to serve. The crown that awaited her had never seemed so distant or so uncertain. But, for the first time since discovering her mother's journal, she felt truly ready to claim it on her own terms, regardless of the cost. The great library of Ravencrest Palace had always been Alara's sanctuary, its towering shelves and ancient tomes offering refuge from the pressures of royal life. But, tonight, as shadows danced between the leather-bound volumes and the flickering candlelight, it felt more like a war room where the final battle plans were being drawn. Sir Thomas Crowe stood before a massive oak table, spreading out documents and maps with the precision of a military strategist. At 28, he possessed the lean build and calloused hands of a knight who had earned his spurs through deed rather than birthright. His dark hair was still damp from his recent journey, and his travel-stained clothes spoke of the urgency that had driven him back to the capital. The evidence is even more damning than we hoped, Your Highness, he said quietly, glancing toward the library doors that Margaret had secured against unwanted intrusion. Lord Samuel Ashford has preserved documents that prove his brother's innocence beyond any doubt, including correspondence with King Aldric of Drakmore that reveals the true scope of Blackthorn treachery. Alara leaned over the table, studying a letter written in elegant script on parchment bearing the royal seal of Drakmore. Even in the uncertain candlelight, she could make out enough to understand its devastating implications. They've been selling our military secrets for 15 years, she whispered, her voice thick with disgust. Troop movements, fortification plans, even the locations of our hidden supply caches. Every advantage Drakmore has gained in recent border skirmishes has been purchased with Valdorian gold and Blackthorn greed. Lord Samuel Ashford emerged from the shadows between the bookcases, his weathered face grave with the weight of long-carried secrets. Though exile had aged him beyond his 60 years, his eyes still burned with the passion for justice that had defined his family for generations. There's worse, Princess, he said, his voice carrying the careful dignity of a man who had lost everything but his honor. The Blackthorns didn't just sell military information. They helped plan Drakmore's strategy for a full invasion, scheduled to begin just 3 months after your coronation. They expected to be rewarded with expanded territories when Valdoria fell under Drakmore's rule. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Margaret gasped audibly, while Sir Thomas's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt. But it was Alara's reaction that filled the library with tension as her face transformed from shocked dismay to blazing fury. They're not just thieves and murderers, she said, her voice low and dangerous. They're traitors planning to sell our entire kingdom to our enemies. Lady Rebecca Ashford stepped forward from where she had been examining the ancient histories that lined the library walls. At 45, she bore the refined beauty of her noble lineage, but 20 years of exile had given her a hardness that made even experienced courtiers step aside when she passed. Her dark red hair was streaked with premature silver, and her green eyes held depths of pain that spoke of losses too great to measure. Your Highness, there's something else you need to know, Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying her words. Something about your mother's death that even our evidence couldn't prove until now. She produced a small vial from her traveling cloak, its glass surface reflecting the candlelight like captured starlight. Within the crystal container, a small amount of white powder caught the light with an almost ethereal glow. Moonbane, Rebecca said simply, and the single word seemed to suck the warmth from the entire library. Thomas stepped back involuntarily. That's been banned throughout the civilized world for decades. Where did you? I took it from Lady Catherine Blackthorne's private chambers when we searched Blackthorne Hall in secret last month, Rebecca interrupted. Hidden behind a false panel in her dressing room, along with detailed notes on dosages and symptoms. Alara felt the world shift beneath her feet as the final piece of her mother's murder fell into place. Moonbane was a poison so rare and exotic that only the wealthiest nobles could afford it, and so subtle in its application that victims appeared to die of natural causes. Administered in tiny doses over months or years, it mimicked wasting diseases that left physicians baffled and families devastated. The symptoms match perfectly, Margaret whispered, her face pale as she remembered Queen Isabella's final illness. The gradual weakness, the breathing difficulties, the way she seemed to fade a little more each day despite the best medical care in the kingdom. Lady Catherine was the Queen's closest friend, Alara said, her voice hollow with betrayal. She visited my mother every day during her illness, bringing her special teas to help with the pain and sleeping draughts to ease her rest. The cruelty of the method struck them all with sickening clarity. Queen Isabella had died slowly, trusting in the kindness of the very woman who was killing her with calculated precision. Each visit, each gesture of friendship, had been another step toward the grave. There's more, Samuel added grimly. Lady Catherine kept detailed records of the dosages and timing. She was experimenting, learning how to kill slowly enough that no one would suspect poison but quickly enough that the victim couldn't effectively resist or expose the plot. Thomas moved to the window, peering through the heavy curtains toward the courtyard where torches now illuminated the continued arrival of nobles for tomorrow's pre-coronation festivities. We have enough evidence to hang them all for treason a dozen times over. The question is whether we can present it effectively before they realize how much we've discovered. They already know something is wrong, Alara said, joining him at the window. Lord Victor has been watching me too carefully, and Marcus has positioned guards in ways that suggest he's preparing for trouble. Lady Catherine even tried to visit me this afternoon with another of her specialties. Margaret shuddered at the implications. You didn't. I accepted it graciously and poured it into the fireplace the moment she left. Alara's smile held no warmth. But the attempt tells me they're growing desperate. They know their time is running out. Young James Ashford, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke from his position near the library's ancient reading chair. At 22, he possessed his grandfather's passionate sense of justice tempered by his mother's strategic mind, making him a formidable ally despite his youth. Your Highness, there's something we haven't discussed, he said carefully. What happens if we succeed? If we expose the Blackthorns and they're removed from power, it will leave enormous gaps in the kingdom's administration. Lord Victor controls the treasury, Marcus commands the royal guard, and Lady Catherine oversees most of the charitable institutions. Removing them all simultaneously could create chaos. It was a sobering point that had kept Alara awake for many nights. The Blackthorns had spent decades consolidating power and placing their allies in key positions throughout the government. Eliminating their influence would be like removing a keystone from an arch, potentially causing the entire structure to collapse. I've been preparing for that, she said, moving to a map of Valdoria that Thomas had spread across the reading table. Sir Thomas has identified loyal nobles who can step into critical roles immediately. Lord Harrison of the Northern Territories has military experience that qualifies him to command the Royal Guard. Earl Pemberton has managed his own estates so efficiently that taking over the treasury should be straightforward. Lady in Westbrook has organized relief efforts for 3 major disasters and can easily handle the charitable institutions. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of her unlikely allies. But we must be careful. The Blackthorns have had 20 years to corrupt or compromise many officials. Anyone who seems too eager to help might be working for them, and anyone who resists our reforms might be protecting their own involvement in the conspiracy. Rebecca nodded approvingly. You've learned to think like a general, princess. Your mother would be proud. The comment brought unexpected tears to Alara's eyes. Throughout this ordeal, she had felt her mother's presence guiding her decisions and strengthening her resolve. The journal had been more than evidence. It had been a final gift from a woman who had died before she could protect her daughter from the very people now threatening the kingdom. "There's one more thing," Samuel said, producing a sealed letter from his travel pack. "This arrived just before we left for the capital. It's from King Aldric of Drakmor himself, intended for Lord Victor. Our contact in the Drakmor court managed to intercept it." The wax seal bore the dragon crest of Drakmor, and Alara could feel her heart pounding as Thomas carefully opened the letter and began to read. His face grew progressively more grim as he absorbed the contents. "Well," Margaret demanded when the silence became unbearable, "King Aldric is concerned about reports reaching him regarding Princess Alara's unusual behavior in recent weeks." Thomas read slowly. "He's ordering Lord Victor to ensure that the coronation proceeds as planned, by any means necessary. If the princess proves uncooperative, he authorizes the use of force to place a more suitable ruler on the throne." The implications hit the room like a thunderbolt. Not only were the Blackthorns planning to betray Valdoria to Drakmor, but their foreign allies were prepared to intervene directly if Alara refused to cooperate with their schemes. Who would they put on the throne? Alara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Marcus Blackthorn has a distant claim through his great-grandmother's marriage to a royal prince 2 centuries ago," Rebecca said bitterly. "It's weak, but it would be enough for Drakmor to justify supporting him as a puppet ruler." The plan was diabolically clever. If Alara accepted the crown and remained under Blackthorn influence, they would continue bleeding the kingdom dry while preparing for eventual annexation by Drakmor. If she resisted, they would eliminate her and install Marcus as a compliant ruler who would complete the betrayal immediately. "Either way, Valdoria falls," Margaret said quietly. "Unless we stop them tomorrow." "Not tomorrow," Alara corrected, her voice carrying new determination. "Tonight." The others looked at her in surprise, but she continued before they could object. "Every hour we wait gives them more time to prepare their defenses or implement their contingency plans. King Aldric's letter proves they're ready to move against me immediately if necessary. We can't wait for the coronation ceremony to expose them, because we might not live to see it." Thomas frowned. "What do you propose, Your Highness?" "We present our evidence tonight, at the pre-coronation feast. Every major noble in the kingdom will be gathered in the Great Hall, including several foreign dignitaries who can serve as witnesses. If we expose the Blackthorns publicly, with incontrovertible proof, they won't be able to deny the charges or eliminate everyone who knows the truth." Samuel shook his head. "That's incredibly dangerous, Princess. They'll have their supporters in the hall, including armed guards. If the evidence isn't immediately convincing to everyone present, we could find ourselves accused of treason and executed before dawn." "The risk is enormous," Rebecca agreed. "But so is the potential reward. If we succeed, we end their threat permanently and save the kingdom. If we fail, at least we'll have tried," Alara said firmly. "And the truth will be spoken, even if we're not alive to see justice done." Margaret moved to her side, taking her hand in a gesture of solidarity. "What would you have us do?" Alara looked around the room at each of her allies, seeing in their faces the same mixture of fear and determination that she felt in her own heart. They were few in number compared to the forces arrayed against them, but they had something their enemies lacked, the absolute certainty that their cause was just. "Sir Thomas, I want you to position loyal guards at every entrance to the Great Hall. Use men whose families have served the crown for generations, not recent appointees who might have been corrupted. If fighting breaks out, we need to control who can enter or leave the hall." Thomas nodded grimly. "I know exactly who to trust, Your Highness." "What else?" "Lord Samuel, I want you and Lady Rebecca to prepare multiple copies of the most damning evidence, hidden throughout the hall where they can be retrieved even if the original documents are destroyed or stolen. James, you'll coordinate with loyal servants to ensure that word of tonight's revelation spreads throughout the palace immediately, so the Blackthorns can't suppress the truth even if they eliminate us. And Margaret," she continued, turning to her closest friend, "I need you to do something that may be the most dangerous task of all. I want you to approach my father privately, before the feast begins, and tell him everything. He deserves to know the truth about my mother's death before I expose it publicly, and his reaction will determine how much support we can expect when the confrontation begins." Margaret's face paled at the enormity of the request. King Aldred had aged significantly since his wife's death, and learning that his most trusted advisors had murdered the woman he loved might shatter his spirit entirely. But he was still the king, and His support would be crucial for legitimizing whatever actions they took against the Blackthorns. "I'll find a way," Margaret promised, though her voice trembled slightly. "But, Elara, what if he doesn't believe us? What if he thinks we're the ones plotting against the crown?" "Then, we'll face the consequences with honor," Elara replied simply. "But I don't think that will happen. Deep in his heart, I believe my father has always suspected that something was wrong. The evidence we present will confirm suspicions he's been afraid to voice." As if summoned by their discussion, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the library corridors. Sir Thomas immediately moved to the window while the others gathered the documents with practiced efficiency, their weeks of clandestine meetings having prepared them for exactly this situation. Multiple guards, approaching fast, Thomas whispered urgently, "Blackthorn colors." The irony was not lost on any of them that the very guards who should have been protecting them were now likely coming to arrest or eliminate them. Marcus Blackthorn had chosen his loyalists well, men who would follow orders without question and who had benefited enough from Blackthorn generosity to ensure their continued cooperation. "The hidden passage," Rebecca said, indicating a section of the library wall where ancient stones had been cunningly arranged to conceal a escape route used by royalty during times of siege. "We can reach your chambers through the old corridors." But Elara shook her head, surprising them all. "No more hiding. No more secret meetings and whispered plans. It's time to bring this conspiracy into the light, even if we're not fully prepared." She moved toward the library doors with the bearing of a queen, her decision made and her course set. "Sir Thomas, escort our guests to safe chambers and ensure they're protected until the feast begins. Margaret, find my father immediately and tell him I request a private audience before tonight's festivities. The rest of you, prepare yourselves for the most important evening in Valdoria's history." The footsteps in the corridor had stopped, and they could hear muffled voices as the guards took up positions around the library. But, instead of fear, Elara felt a strange sense of relief. The game of shadows and secrets was ending, and soon everything would be decided in the clear light of truth. "Are you certain about this?" Thomas asked quietly. "Once we open those doors, there's no going back to the safety of careful planning and gradual revelation." Elara smiled, and, for the first time in weeks, it reached her eyes. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Sir Thomas. My mother died because she tried to fight this conspiracy in secret. I won't make the same mistake." She moved to the heavy oak doors and placed her hand on the iron handle, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a royal cloak. Outside, the guards were waiting with their own plans and loyalties. Inside, her small group of allies prepared for a confrontation that would determine whether justice or corruption would rule Valdoria for the next generation. The crown had never seemed so distant or so vital. But Princess Elara Whitmore was ready to claim it on her own terms, regardless of who tried to stand in her way. The great hall of Ravencrest Palace had never looked more magnificent or more ominous. Ancient banners hung from the vaulted ceiling like sleeping dragons, their rich colors illuminated by hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows across the assembled nobility. The long tables groaned under the weight of golden platters and crystal goblets, while musicians in the gallery played melodies that had celebrated royal occasions for centuries. Yet beneath the splendor, an undercurrent of tension hummed through the air like a bowstring drawn too tight. Princess Elara entered the hall with measured steps, her midnight blue gown flowing behind her like liquid starlight. The color had been chosen deliberately, as blue was traditionally worn by royalty during times of judgment and justice. Her mother's sapphire necklace caught the candlelight at her throat, each gem seeming to pulse with inner fire. But it was her expression that drew every eye in the vast chamber, a mask of serene determination that concealed the storm raging beneath. King Aldred sat upon his throne at the head of the hall, his once powerful frame diminished by grief and the weight of his years. Margaret's private conversation with him an hour earlier had left visible marks on his weathered face, and his hands trembled slightly as he raised his goblet in greeting to his daughter. The truth about Queen Isabella's murder had struck him like a physical blow, but it had also awakened something that had been sleeping in his eyes for too long, a flicker of the fierce king he had once been. To the king's right, Lord Victor Blackthorn stood in his traditional place of honor, resplendent in black velvet trimmed with silver. His pale eyes swept the hall with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, but Elara noticed the subtle signs of preparation that marked a predator ready to strike. Marcus Blackthorne commanded the guards positioned along the walls, their hands resting casually on their sword hilts in a display that appeared ceremonial, but could become deadly in seconds. Lady Catherine Blackthorne graced the ladies' table with her usual elegant poise, her silver hair arranged in elaborate braids that emphasized her regal bearing. She smiled warmly at Alara as the princess passed, the same maternal expression that had comforted a grieving child 20 years ago. Now, knowing the truth behind that kindness, Alara felt her stomach clench with revulsion. Sir Thomas had positioned his loyal guards with military precision throughout the hall. They appeared to be part of the normal ceremonial display, but each man was prepared for the signal that would transform a royal feast into a battlefield. The tension between the two factions was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. Lord Samuel Ashford had entered through a side door, his presence causing ripples of whispered recognition among the older nobles who remembered the scandal of his family's disgrace. Lady Rebecca followed with her son James, their bearing proud despite the years of exile. Several courtiers tried to approach them, curiosity overcoming protocol, but Sir Thomas's men subtly discouraged such interactions. As Alara took her place at the head table beside her father, she caught sight of the foreign dignitaries who would serve as witnesses to whatever unfolded tonight. The ambassador from Drakmore sat near the center of the hall, his dark eyes watching the proceedings with more than casual interest. Representatives from 5 other kingdoms were also present, their presence ensuring that news of tonight's events would spread far beyond Valdoria's borders. "You look beautiful tonight, my dear," King Aldred said quietly, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. The private revelation about his wife's murder had transformed him from a grieving widower into a monarch seeking justice, and Alara could see the steel returning to his gaze. "Thank you, father," she replied, her voice equally controlled. "I hope tonight will be remembered as the beginning of a new chapter for our kingdom." Lord Victor stepped forward with the ceremonial cup that traditionally marked the beginning of formal festivities. "Your Majesty, Your Highness, shall we toast to tomorrow's coronation and the bright future that awaits Valdoria?" The irony of the moment was not lost on anyone who knew the truth. The man who had spent decades betraying the kingdom was asking them to toast its future, apparently unaware that his own past was about to be dragged into the light. "Indeed," Alara said, rising gracefully from her chair. "But before we celebrate tomorrow, I believe there are matters from yesterday that require our attention." A subtle change rippled through the hall as her words registered. Conversations quieted, and even the musicians seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, their melodies becoming more subdued. Lord Victor's smile never wavered, but his eyes sharpened with newfound alertness. "Princess," Lady Catherine said sweetly, rising from her own table, "surely tonight is meant for celebration, not the tedious business of governance. Such matters can wait until after your coronation, when you'll have the full authority of the crown to address any concerns." "Some matters cannot wait," Alara replied, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet hall, "especially when they concern the very legitimacy of that crown and the safety of those who would wear it." The statement hit the assembled nobles like a thunderclap. Whispers erupted throughout the hall as people tried to understand what their future queen was suggesting. Several Blackthorne supporters began moving toward the doors, but Sir Thomas's guards had already sealed the exits with polite but unmistakable firmness. King Aldred slowly rose from his throne, the ceremonial crown of Valdoria catching the candlelight as he moved. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority that had commanded armies and shaped kingdoms. "Let all present hear the words of Princess Alara Whitmore, heir to the throne of Valdoria and beloved daughter of our realm. The matters she would address tonight concern the very heart of our kingdom, and every noble family has the right to hear evidence that affects us all." The formal pronouncement sent shockwaves through the hall. By invoking the ancient right of public testimony, the king had essentially placed the evening's proceedings under the protection of royal law. Any attempt to suppress or violence to prevent what followed would constitute high treason against the crown itself. Marcus Blackthorne's hand moved instinctively toward his sword, but his father caught his eye and shook his head almost imperceptibly. Whatever they had planned for this moment, it would have to wait until they understood exactly how much Alara knew and could prove. "Thank you, Your Majesty," Alara said, moving to the center of the hall where everyone could see her clearly. 20 years ago, this kingdom suffered a terrible tragedy when a group of northern lords was executed for treason against the crown. Tonight, I stand before you with evidence that those men died not as traitors, but as patriots who discovered a conspiracy so vast and so treacherous that it threatened the very existence of our realm." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the assembly. In the sudden silence, she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears like war drums. Lord Gareth Ashford and his allies were not plotting against my father's reign, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. They were trying to expose systematic corruption and betrayal by the very advisors my father trusted most. They died because they discovered that members of our own nobility had been selling our secrets to enemy kingdoms, stealing from our treasury, and manipulating royal policies for their own enrichment. Lord Victor stepped forward, his expression a masterpiece of injured dignity. "Your Highness, these are serious accusations that require serious proof. The loyalty of my family to the crown has been demonstrated across 3 centuries of faithful service. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, surely it should be examined by proper authorities rather than aired in public spectacle." "The proper authorities have been compromised," Alara replied coldly. "How can we trust investigators when the crimes reach into the very heart of the royal administration?" She gestured to Sir Thomas, who moved forward carrying a leather satchel filled with documents. "But you're right about one thing, Lord Victor. Such accusations do require proof. Fortunately, I have it." Sir Thomas began distributing copies of the most damning evidence to the noble families throughout the hall, while Lady Rebecca and James Ashford emerged from their positions to stand beside Alara. The sight of the Ashford survivors caused another wave of whispers, as many recognized the family whose patriarch had died in disgrace 2 decades earlier. "Lord Samuel Ashford has preserved documents that prove his brother's innocence and reveal the true scope of the conspiracy against our kingdom," Alara announced. "Among them are letters from King Aldric of Drakmore, acknowledging payments received from military intelligence and expressing satisfaction with information provided about our defensive capabilities." Samuel stepped forward, his voice carrying the dignity of a man who had waited 20 years for justice. "The letters are written in King Aldric's own hand and bear his personal seal. They detail specific troop movements, fortification plans, and strategic weaknesses that could only have been provided by someone with access to our highest military councils." A noble from the Eastern Territories stood up, holding one of the distributed documents. "This letter mentions the hidden supply depot at Raven's Hollow. Only 3 people knew of its location: the king, the commander of the royal guard, and the chief royal advisor." All eyes turned toward Marcus Blackthorne, whose position as guard commander made him an obvious suspect. But Marcus remained calm, his military bearing unchanged as he faced the implied accusation. "These documents could be forgeries," he said evenly. "King Aldric is our enemy. He would have every reason to create false evidence that would tear our kingdom apart from within." It was a reasonable defense, and several nobles nodded their agreement. But Lady Rebecca had anticipated this response. "You're absolutely right to be suspicious of enemy documents," she said, producing another set of papers from her traveling cloak. "That's why we also recovered these from a hidden chamber in Blackthorn Hall itself." The second revelation sent visible shockwaves through the Blackthorn faction. Lady Catherine's carefully composed expression cracked slightly, while Lord Victor's pale eyes fixed on Rebecca with undisguised hatred. "Treasury records showing systematic theft over 15 years, Rebecca announced, reading from the papers. "Personal correspondence between the Blackthorns and Drakmore agents, including detailed plans for a coordinated invasion. And, most damning of all, records of payments made to various officials throughout the kingdom in exchange for their cooperation in the conspiracy." She held up a particular document that caught the candlelight like a weapon. "This is a list of nobles who have received Blackthorn gold in exchange for their loyalty. Lord Garrett of the Western Provinces, Earl Montgomery of the Southern Territories, Baron Caldwell of the mining regions. Over 30 families have been compromised." The named nobles went pale as their corruption was exposed, while others began moving away from them as if treason might be contagious. The careful alliance that the Blackthorns had built over decades was crumbling in real time as fear overrode loyalty. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Alara moved to the center of the hall again, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "There's more," she said, her words falling into sudden silence. "Evidence that proves the corruption goes beyond treason and theft. Evidence of murder." Lady Catherine stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. "This has gone far enough. Princess Alara is obviously unwell, suffering from the stress of her approaching coronation. These wild fantasies. My mother didn't die of natural causes, Alara interrupted, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. Queen Isabella was murdered, slowly and deliberately, by someone she trusted completely. The accusation hit the hall like a physical explosion. Several women gasped audibly, while men reached for weapons that court protocol had required them to leave at the door. Even the foreign dignitaries leaned forward, recognizing the historical significance of what they were witnessing. King Aldred's face had turned to stone, but his eyes blazed with a fury that reminded everyone present why he had once been called the Iron King. Explain these charges, my daughter. Alara looked directly at Lady Catherine, who stood frozen like a deer sensing the approach of wolves. Lady Catherine Blackthorne administered poison to my mother over a period of months, using her position as the Queen's closest friend to deliver deadly doses in the guise of medicinal teas and sleeping draughts. That's impossible, Lady Catherine said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isabella was like a sister to me. I mourned her death as deeply as any of you. Rebecca stepped forward, producing the vial of white powder that would seal Lady Catherine's fate. Moonbane, she said simply, found hidden in your private chambers, along with detailed notes on dosages and symptoms. The progression described in your records matches exactly the course of Queen Isabella's final illness. The vial caught the candlelight as Rebecca held it up for all to see, its contents seeming to glow with malevolent purpose. The mere sight of the legendary poison sent nobles scrambling backward, as if proximity alone might prove fatal. You search my chambers? Lady Catherine's voice cracked with the first sign of real fear. We searched all your properties, James Ashford said, speaking for the first time since entering the hall. Blackthorn Hall, your town residence, even your country estate. The evidence of your crimes spans decades. Lord Victor finally abandoned his facade of injured innocence, his aristocratic mask falling away to reveal the calculating predator beneath. Even if these accusations were true, which they are not, you have no authority to act upon them. Princess Alara is not yet queen, and King Aldred. He paused significantly. King Aldred has not been himself since his wife's death. Perhaps it's time for younger, more capable hands to guide Valdoria's future. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus Blackthorne stepped forward, and suddenly, half the guards in the hall moved with him, their loyalty revealed by their actions. The carefully planned coup was finally beginning, triggered by the exposure they had hoped to prevent. But Sir Thomas had been prepared for exactly this moment. His own guards moved simultaneously, creating a barrier between the Blackthorns and the royal family, while sealing off escape routes that might allow the traitors to flee. I wouldn't, Sir Thomas said quietly, his hand resting on his sword hilt as he faced Marcus across the suddenly divided hall. Your men are outnumbered, and you're surrounded by witnesses from 6 kingdoms. Any violence here tonight would be seen as confirmation of every charge that's been leveled against your family. Marcus smiled coldly. Witnesses can be silenced, Sir Thomas, and kingdoms fall when they're ruled by weak leaders who trust the wrong people. But before he could draw his sword, King Aldred's voice boomed across the hall with the authority of absolute monarchy. Enough! The single word carried such power that every person in the great hall froze in place. Nobles and guards alike recognizing the voice of a king who had commanded armies and conquered enemies. In that moment, the grief-stricken widower disappeared, replaced by the Iron King who had forged Valdoria into a power that neighboring kingdoms respected and feared. Marcus Blackthorne, you stand accused of high treason against the crown, King Aldred proclaimed, his voice echoing from the ancient stones. Victor Blackthorne, you are charged with conspiracy, theft, and the betrayal of royal trust. Catherine Blackthorne, you face accusations of murder and poisoning of the queen. He paused, his eyes sweeping the hall to include every person present. By the ancient laws of Valdoria, you have the right to trial by combat or trial by testimony. Choose now, before God and these witnesses, how you will answer for your crimes. The challenge hung in the air like a sword poised to fall. The Blackthorns stood at the center of a rapidly closing circle, their decades of careful manipulation finally coming to an end. Around them, the nobles of Valdoria waited to see whether justice would be served through law or through blood. Princess Alara stood beside her father, no longer just an heir to the throne but a queen in all but name, ready to claim her crown through fire if necessary. The feast that was supposed to celebrate her approaching coronation had become the trial that would determine whether she would rule a free kingdom or a conquered one. The next moments would decide the fate of them all. The silence that followed King Aldred's challenge stretched through the great hall like a held breath, every noble and servant frozen in anticipation of the response that would determine Valdoria's fate. The ancient stones seemed to remember other moments of crisis, other times when loyalty and betrayal had danced together in the shadows of power, waiting to see which would emerge victorious. Lord Victor Blackthorn stood at the center of the accusatory circle, his silver hair catching the candlelight as his mind raced through options that grew fewer with each passing second. The careful web of corruption and manipulation that had taken decades to weave was unraveling in real time, and the architect of that web finally understood that his greatest miscalculation had been underestimating the steel that lay beneath Princess Elara's delicate exterior. "Your Majesty," Victor said finally, his voice carrying the smooth confidence that had served him well in countless political negotiations. "These charges are based on evidence that could easily have been fabricated by our enemies." King Aldric of Drakmor would gain immensely from seeing Valdoria's nobility tear itself apart based on forged documents and planted poison. It was a desperate gambit, but not without merit. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably as they considered the implications. Foreign manipulation was a constant threat that every kingdom faced, and the evidence against the Blackthorns, while compelling, came primarily from sources with their own reasons for seeking revenge. But Lady Rebecca Ashford had anticipated this final line of defense. From her position near the royal table, she produced a document that she had deliberately held in reserve for exactly this moment. "Perhaps Lord Victor would care to explain this," she said, unfolding a parchment that bore the distinctive wax seal of Blackthorn Hall. A letter written in his own hand to King Aldric, dated just 3 weeks ago, expressing concern about Princess Elara's troublesome independence and requesting immediate military support to deal with domestic complications after the coronation. The letter passed from hand to hand among the assembled nobles, each reader's expression growing more grim as they absorbed its contents. Unlike the earlier documents, this one could not be dismissed as enemy forgery. The handwriting was unmistakably Victor's, the seal was genuine, and the paper bore the watermark used exclusively by the royal chancellery. Moreover, Rebecca continued, producing yet another devastating piece of evidence. "We have testimony from Captain Willem of the merchant vessel Star's Edge, who personally delivered this letter to Drakmor agents in the port city of Blackwater. He was paid with gold coins bearing the Blackthorn family crest." Captain Willem stepped forward from where he had been waiting among the servants, his weathered face grave with the weight of his testimony. As a merchant sailor who had traded throughout the known world, his reputation for honesty was beyond question. "I can identify Lord Victor's hand from the many shipping contracts I've processed for Blackthorn commercial ventures," Willem said in his steady captain's voice. "And I can testify that the gold I received came directly from Marcus Blackthorn himself, who hired my ship specifically to ensure the letter reached Drakmor without being intercepted by Valdorian customs." Marcus stepped forward, his military bearing unchanged despite the mounting evidence against his family. "You have the testimony of a hired messenger and documents that could still be forgeries. But you have no proof of actual wrongdoing beyond the word of people with obvious motivations for revenge. Don't we?" Elara said quietly, producing the final piece of evidence that would seal the Blackthorn's fate. "Sir Thomas, would you bring in our last witness?" The great doors of the hall opened to admit a figure that caused Lord Victor to stagger backward as if he had seen a ghost. Lady and Pemberton entered with slow, careful steps, leaning on a walking stick, but very much alive despite the reports of her death that had circulated through the court 6 months earlier. "Impossible," Lady Catherine whispered, her face draining of all color. "You died of fever. I attended your funeral myself." Lady Anne smiled grimly as she approached the center of the hall, her survival clearly marking her as a living contradiction to Blackthorn expectations. "I did indeed fall gravely ill, Lady Catherine. After drinking the special tisane you so kindly prepared for me when I mentioned my concerns about irregularities in the charitable fund distributions." The accusation hung in the air like an axe poised to fall. Lady Anne's supposed death had been convenient timing for the Blackthorns, eliminating a witness who had discovered their theft from the kingdom's charitable institutions just before she could present her evidence to the king. "Fortunately," and continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, My personal physician recognized the symptoms of moonbane poisoning from his studies in the Eastern Kingdoms. He was able to treat the early stages of the poisoning and fake my death to prevent further attempts on my life while we gathered evidence. She turned to face the assembled nobles, many of whom had mourned her passing and contributed to memorials in her honor. For 6 months, I have been living in secret, working with Sir Thomas and the Ashford family to document the full scope of Blackthorn corruption. I have witnessed their crimes firsthand and can testify to their guilt before God and these witnesses. The revelation that Lady Anne had survived her poisoning sent shockwaves through the Blackthorn faction. If their attempt to murder her had failed, what other supposedly dead witnesses might emerge from hiding? The foundation of their power structure was not just cracking, it was collapsing entirely. King Aldred rose from his throne, the crown of Eldoria catching the torchlight as he moved with the deliberate pace of absolute authority. Lady Catherine Blackthorn, you stand accused of the attempted murder of Lady Anne Pemberton and the successful murder of Queen Isabella. How do you answer these charges? For the first time since the accusations began, Lady Catherine's composure completely shattered. The elegant noblewoman who had commanded respect throughout the kingdom began to sob, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast hall. Isabella was never supposed to die. The poison was meant to make her weak, compliant, easier to control. But she was so strong, so determined to investigate the irregularities she had noticed. We had to increase the dosages, and then the confession struck the assembled nobles like a thunderbolt. Even those who had supported the Blackthorns in the past began backing away as the full horror of the Queen's murder was revealed. To kill a monarch was the ultimate crime against the divine order that governed their world. And Lady Anne, King Aldred's voice had become dangerously quiet. She discovered our manipulation of the charitable funds, Catherine continued, her words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and fear. She was going to expose everything, destroy all our work, ruin our family's position. We had no choice. Lord Victor grabbed his sister's arm, trying to silence her before she could implicate the family further, but the damage was already done. Her confession had confirmed every accusation made against them and revealed the cold calculation behind their crimes. Marcus stepped forward, his hand finally moving to his sword hilt as he recognized that legal defenses were no longer possible. Enough words, he declared, his voice carrying across the hall with military authority. You want justice? Then, let's settle this in the old way, with steel and courage rather than accusations and testimony. The challenge sent a ripple of excitement through the assembled nobles. Trial by combat was an ancient rite that had not been invoked in the royal court for over a century, but it remained a legal option for those accused of capital crimes. If Marcus could defeat a royal champion in single combat, the charges against his family would be considered divinely rejected. I accept your challenge, Sir Thomas said immediately, stepping forward with the fluid grace of a born warrior. As Princess Alara's champion, I claim the right to defend the honor of the crown and seek justice for the crimes committed against our realm. But before either man could draw his weapon, a new voice rang out across the hall with surprising authority. The challenge is mine to accept, Princess Alara declared, moving to stand between the two warriors. I am the one who brought these accusations forward, and I am the one whose right to rule has been questioned by the Blackthorn conspiracy. If trial by combat is to determine the truth, then let me be the one to fight for it. The suggestion sent shockwaves through the assembly. While princesses had traditionally been trained in combat arts for self-defense, the idea of the heir to the throne risking her life in a formal duel was virtually unprecedented. Several nobles began voicing objections, but King Aldred's raised hand silenced them all. The ancient laws are clear, he said gravely. The accused may choose trial by combat, and the accuser has the right to serve as champion or name another to fight in their place. If Princess Alara wishes to defend her accusations personally, that is her royal prerogative. Marcus smiled coldly as he considered the implications. Even if Alara was skilled with a blade, which he doubted, he had spent years training with the best swordsmen in the kingdom. Victory would not only clear his family of all charges, but also eliminate the one person capable of ruling effectively against their interests. I accept Princess Alara as my opponent, he declared formally. Let the gods determine the truth through trial by combat. Alara nodded calmly, though her heart was racing with the magnitude of what she had committed herself to. She had indeed been trained in swordplay from childhood, as was proper for royal offspring. But Marcus was a professional warrior with years of battlefield experience. The odds were heavily against her, but the symbolic importance of fighting for justice personally outweighed the practical dangers. Clear the center of the hall, King Aldred commanded, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of royal tradition. Let the ancient circle of judgment be formed, and let all present witness that justice is served according to the laws of our ancestors. Servants quickly moved the tables and chairs to create a large circular space in the center of the great hall, while nobles formed a ring around the designated combat area. The atmosphere had transformed from tense political drama to something more primal and ancient, the gathering of a tribe to witness divine judgment through combat. Sir Thomas approached Alara with weapons selected from the royal armory, a balanced sword that had been crafted specifically for her measurements, and a small round shield bearing the royal arms. As he helped her adjust the leather armor that had been quickly brought from her chambers, he whispered urgent advice about Marcus's fighting style and preferred tactics. He favors aggressive opening attacks, Thomas said quietly, trying to overwhelm opponents with superior strength and experience. But his training has been primarily against male opponents. Your speed and agility are advantages he may not be prepared for. Alara nodded, testing the weight of her sword and practicing a few basic forms to warm up her muscles. Around the circle, she could see faces ranging from worried to excited to calculating as the assembled nobles tried to predict the outcome of a battle that would reshape their kingdom's future. Marcus entered the circle with confident strides, his armor gleaming and his sword catching the torchlight as he moved. He had chosen his finest equipment for this moment, the plate and mail that had protected him through numerous campaigns, and the blade that had never failed to serve him in battle. Are both champions prepared? King Aldred asked formally, his voice carrying the ritual words that had preceded such combats for 1,000 years. I am ready to defend the honor of the crown and seek justice for the crimes against our realm. Alara replied clearly, her voice carrying across the silent hall. I am ready to prove my family's innocence and expose the lies that threaten our kingdom, Marcus responded, though his declaration rang hollow after his sister's confession. Then, let the trial begin, the king declared, stepping back to join the circle of witnesses. May God's will be done through strength of arms and purity of purpose. The two fighters moved to opposite sides of the circle, weapons ready, as centuries of tradition and the weight of justice hung in the balance. Everything that had led to this moment, all the evidence and accusations and political maneuvering, would now be decided by steel and skill and the courage to fight for what was right. In the flickering torchlight of the great hall, Princess Alara prepared to claim her crown not through inheritance or ceremony, but through the ancient trial that would prove her worthy to rule a kingdom where justice mattered more than convenience. The future of Valdoria balanced on the edge of her sword. The circle of torchlight in the great hall had become an arena where the fate of a kingdom would be decided by the clash of steel and the courage of two hearts beating with the rhythm of destiny. Princess Alara stood at the western edge of the combat space, her sword catching the flickering light as she steadied her breathing and called upon every lesson her weapons masters had taught her since childhood. Across from her, Marcus Blackthorne moved with the predatory confidence of a man who had never lost a formal duel. The assembled nobles formed a living wall around the combat circle, their faces reflecting mixtures of excitement, fear, and anticipation as they prepared to witness an event that would become legend regardless of its outcome. Foreign dignitaries leaned forward in their chairs, recognizing that they were about to observe a pivotal moment in Valdorian history that would be discussed in royal courts throughout the civilized world. King Aldred stood at the northern point of the circle, the crown of Valdoria reflecting the torchlight as he raised his hand to signal the beginning of combat. In this moment, he was not just a grieving widower or a tired old king, but the embodiment of royal authority stretching back through generations of monarchs who had ruled through strength and wisdom. Let the trial by combat commence, he declared, his voice echoing through the ancient stones of Ravencrest Palace. May justice be served through strength of arms and purity of purpose. Marcus attacked immediately, his sword whistling through the air in a powerful overhead strike designed to end the combat quickly and decisively. But Alara was ready for his aggressive opening, sliding to her right and allowing his blade to crash harmlessly against the stone floor while she struck at his exposed flank. Her sword rang against his mail with a sound like a bell tolling, drawing first blood as the tip found a gap between the metal rings and traced a thin red line across his ribs. The wound was superficial but symbolically powerful, proving that the princess was no helpless maiden but a skilled warrior worthy of respect. Marcus stepped back, reassessing his opponent with new appreciation for her abilities. The opening exchange had revealed that Alara possessed both speed and tactical awareness that his training had not prepared him to face. His next attack would require more careful planning. First, blood to the princess, Sir Thomas murmured to Lady Margaret, who stood beside him in the circle of witnesses. Marcus expected to overwhelm her with brute strength, but she's fighting intelligently. Indeed, Alara had spent the opening moments studying her opponent's style and identifying weaknesses that might be exploited. Marcus favored powerful attacks that relied on his superior strength and reach, but such tactics left him momentarily vulnerable after each strike. His armor, while impressive, was designed for battlefield combat rather than the precise maneuvering required for single combat in a confined space. The second exchange began when Marcus attempted a series of rapid thrusts designed to drive Alara back against the circle of witnesses. But, instead of retreating, she moved forward and, to her left, using her shield to deflect his blade, while bringing her own sword up in a rising cut that forced him to abandon his attack and defend himself. Steel rang against steel as the two fighters tested each other's skills, their weapons creating a deadly dance illuminated by torchlight and witnessed by the most powerful nobles in the kingdom. Each clash revealed new aspects of their respective abilities, and the assembled observers began to understand that they were watching not a predetermined execution, but a genuine contest between worthy opponents. Lady Catherine Blackthorne watched from her position among the accused, her earlier confession having stripped away any pretense of innocence, but leaving her desperate for her son's victory. If Marcus could triumph in this ancient trial, divine judgment would be seen as vindicating their family despite the evidence presented against them. But, with each passing moment, it became clear that Princess Alara was no sacrificial lamb, but a lioness fighting for her kingdom. Lord Victor maintained his aristocratic composure, but his pale eyes betrayed the growing fear that decades of careful planning were about to be destroyed by a young woman with a sword and an unshakable commitment to justice. The political calculations that had always served him well were useless here, where only skill and courage mattered. The third exchange proved decisive in shifting the momentum of the combat. Marcus attempted a complex combination attack, his sword weaving patterns designed to confuse and overwhelm his opponent. But Alara read his intentions clearly, recognizing the maneuver as one she had practiced countless times with Sir Thomas during their training sessions. As Marcus committed to his final thrust, believing he had created an opening in her defenses, Alara stepped inside his guard with fluid grace. Her shield arm shot forward, the metal boss striking him squarely in the chest with enough force to stagger him backward, while her sword moved in a precise arc that found the gap between his helmet and his gorget. The blade stopped just short of his throat, close enough that he could feel the cold steel against his skin, but controlled enough to avoid delivering a killing blow. In that frozen moment, with death balanced on the edge of a sword, both fighters understood that the trial had reached its conclusion. "Yield," Alara said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly silent hall. "The gods have rendered their judgment." Marcus looked into her eyes, seeing not triumph, but a sadness that spoke to the tragedy of what his family's choices had cost them all. He could have continued fighting, perhaps found some desperate stratagem to turn defeat into victory, but the honor that had been instilled in him from childhood would not allow him to prolong a battle that divine judgment had clearly decided. "I yield," he said formally, letting his sword fall from his hand to ring against the stone floor. Princess Alara Whitmore has proven her accusations through trial by combat. The gods have spoken. The great hall erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps as the assembled nobles absorbed the implications of what they had witnessed. Not only had Princess Alara proven her physical courage and skill, but she had demonstrated the divine favor that traditional law required for legitimate rulership. Any lingering doubts about her fitness to rule had been answered with steel and determination. King Aldred moved to the center of the circle, his voice carrying the authority of absolute monarchy as he proclaimed the verdict. "By ancient law and divine judgment, the accusations against the Blackthorne family have been proven true. Victor Blackthorne, Marcus Blackthorne, and Catherine Blackthorne are hereby found guilty of high treason, murder, conspiracy, and betrayal of the royal trust. The formal pronouncement sent shockwaves through the Blackthorne faction, as supporters who had maintained their loyalty through the accusations